There was plenty to be excited about for fans when heading into the final arc of Bleach, but I think one of the things that fans were most excited for was the possibility of finally getting to see some of those unrevealed Bankai that we hadn't seen at that point in time. And I know for myself, and I think for much of the community as well, Kyoraku Shunsui's Bankai topped that list as one of the Bankai we absolutely couldn't wait to see. This Bankai was unique. It had been teased since the fake Karakura Town arc, but also it was one of those few promised Bankai that Kubo himself had actually brought up in interviews that he was planning on showing in the Thousand Year Blood War, so that only increased anticipation further. And it's really hard to gauge whether or not this Bankai actually delivered or not. Despite Kyoraku being my favourite captain, Katen Kyokotsu being one of my favourite Zanpakuto, it's also all very abstract. The Shikai is quite abstract, and the Bankai we received in chapter 647 is even more so. I think it's a weird situation with this Bankai, because I think people had huge expectations, but at the same time didn't know what to expect. And so in this video we're going to take a look at Kyoraku's Bankai, which we did eventually get right near the end of the series, Katen Kyokotsu Karamatsu Shinju. I'm going to do my best to explain what I think this Bankai actually is, what it does, how it works, and what it represents. We're going to look at the themes and the imagery surrounding the Bankai, and also I'm just going to give a little bit of an idea of how I might have changed the Bankai to maybe make it a little bit more satisfying for those who've been waiting for so long. Before we begin, guys, if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that button now. We're so close to 60,000 subs, and I would love to hit that milestone. So if you haven't hit the button yet, I'd really appreciate you doing that for Bleach videos like this every week. Also, give the video a thumbs up if you found it enjoyable, useful, anything like that, because it does help to increase the reach on YouTube. It just means that more people get to see it. And also, I do have a Patreon now as well. If you want to help me out over there, if you want to support me even just a little bit more, I would really appreciate it. In fact, we're very nearly at 50 patrons now, and that's a milestone I would love to reach. So if you want to support me for as little as $1 a month, you can do, and it all goes a long way to helping me do these videos. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy. So if Kyoraku's Shikai Katen Kyokotsu reflects the playful, childish, and unpredictable side of Kyoraku that he very often showcases to the world, then his Bankai Katen Kyokotsu Karamatsu Shinju reflects the inner darkness of Kyoraku, that slightly more morose version of him that he often kind of keeps hidden away, at least until the Thousand Year Blood War arc rolled around and he had a lot more responsibility to shoulder. I think when he started having to carry those burdens, we saw that inner darkness of Kyoraku come out a little bit more. There were small hints to it in the previous arcs, but the final arc is really where you get to see it, and his Bankai fittingly represents that. So Kyoraku's Bankai is undeniably pretty abstract. It is kind of difficult to glean exactly how it works just by looking at it in the manga. I'm going to be using the Viz translation, as I think that's probably going to be the most reliable one, for me at least anyway. But yeah, I think probably the easiest way to start this video at least is just to go over the Bankai first, what it actually does in the manga, and then we can try and pick it apart afterwards. The Bankai tells the story of a pair of lovers who agreed to commit suicide beneath a withered black pine tree, essentially. I told you it was pretty dark. It does reflect Kyoraku's kind of sad but romantic nature, that melancholy aspect to his character that's also very theatrical. And in many ways, I think the themes of this Bankai really do reflect him very well. The story of the Bankai is presented in a 4-act play, so I think, like I said, the best way of doing this is just going over the acts one by one. However, before we even get to the acts, we have to set the stage, and I think this is how the Bankai actually initially activates. Kyoraku uses his Bankai in chapter 647, and I just want to point out as well, in one of my last videos about ranking the battles in the Arrancar arc, I mentioned that Ikkaku's Bankai reveal is one of my favourites, as it's such a quintessential Bankai reveal, featuring all the tropes that I absolutely love. And I think Kyoraku's actually nails that as well. There is a sense of believing its own hype with Kyoraku's Bankai. I think they knew that people were so excited to see it. It gets great build-up. There's a lot of kind of build-up to that. There is a lot of scene setting with his Bankai as well. Whereas with characters like Kisuke and Kenpachi, it can kind of feel like their Bankais just sort of come and go. when by all means they should be just as hype as Kyoraku's, but Kyoraku's is handled really, really well. I love him like running away from the fight to kind of just prepare himself, lying up against a wall thinking that he's exhausted all of his options, and he really hopes that Nanao doesn't get caught up in this. It feels like the usage of Katen, Kyokotsu, Karamatsu, Shinju is warranted, which I think is really important, and it makes it all the more exciting to see it finally unleashed. But once Kyoraku activates his Bankai, before we see any of the acts in play, the whole world is blanketed by a darkness, a sinister darkness that creates this melancholy feeling in the air. The temperature seems to plummet, people get chills, and the effects of this are felt apparently all throughout the Varvelt, as far as Ichigo and his friends, with Orihime noting that she feels like she's shivering and she feels horrible inside. Chad mentions that the temperature actually hasn't fallen and the sky hasn't actually darkened, but it is like an illusory thing that's actually giving them the sensation of the chills inside right to their very core. And I think that is truly fantastic scene setting, really kind of emphasizing the feelings of despair and the gloominess of the battlefield as Kyoraku arrives anew. And so we get Act 1 of the play. This one's honestly pretty self-explanatory. It's a sharing of the wounds. Basically, if you have injured your opponent prior to the Bankai being used, you will then have those wounds reflected upon you. Leal shot Kyoraku in 2 separate places with perfectly round bullets. There are bullet holes punched through Kyoraku, and as soon as the Bankai activates, Leal gets those same injuries blasted into his body. Kyoraku notes as well that no matter the extent of the injury, you will not die from it. So really, I think Act 1 is just done to set up a level playing field between the two combatants. Kyoraku notes it is a prologue of sorts, so really it is part of the whole scene setting, getting them ready for the main event, and it is just to create that level playing field. It's also great because Leal's kind of freaking out at this point. You know, he's supposed to be intangible, he's not supposed to be able to take any damage, and Kyoraku just says to him, you know, you need to be quiet, I don't want any more talking during acts. The show is about to begin, the performance is about to begin, so you can kind of imagine like the curtain being lifted at this time and unveiling kind of essentially the horrors that are yet to come for Leal. We then get Act 2, which in my opinion is the most confusing and abstract of the 4 of them, and I will go into greater detail once this little recap is done. So essentially this one is the Pillow of Shame, and Leal is stricken with an incurable disease which essentially looks like the plague, covering his face in like boils, and blood is running out of every orifice from his eyes, his nose, his mouth. It looks genuinely pretty gory. And I actually have to say I can't wait to see how the anime tackles the Bankai. I think it's really going to help, actually. I think it'd be really great actually seeing darkness descend upon Varvelt, seeing how they use music here to really generate this sinister atmosphere. I hope they go crazy with it, to be honest, because I think that would be absolutely fitting. But anyway, Leal is now bleeding out of everywhere on his face, and Act 3 begins, which is known as the Abyss. And essentially, Kyoraku and Leal are both just thrown into this massive ocean of water that kind of comes out of nowhere, and is visually kind of hard to comprehend, because does the ocean just start somewhere in the sky and it's like a cube of water that they're trapped in? At the end of the day, it's illusory, it's not real, so you kind of have to assume that maybe everyone else can't actually see this. It's kind of weird to think about. But basically the idea behind this is once you've been thrown into the water, your resolve starts to fade away and you begin to panic and you grow scared. And Kyoraku says that they will now stay underwater until one of them runs out of Reiatsu. So at this point, you're going to get the impression it becomes a battle of endurance, though I think there's a little more to it than that. I don't think it's quite that straightforward. And then we move to the final act, which is essentially a one-hit kill move. Kyoraku creates a string of Reiatsu around Ilbaro's neck and cuts his head off in one move, using the blood-stained throat-cutting shears, essentially. And that does seemingly finish off Ilbaro. Kyoraku brings down one of the most powerful Sternritter just by using his Bankai. And so that is the 4 steps of his Bankai kind of explained to you, but now I want to go into in a little bit more detail to see if we can kind of analyse how this thing actually links together and how it actually works. So looking at stage 1 then, the sharing of the wounds, like I said, it's pretty self-explanatory, that one, but there are a couple of little bits and bobs I want to just talk about briefly. Kyoraku obviously hasn't actually wounded Lille at this point and therefore gets away scot-free when this part of the Bankai activates. But if Lille had been injured prior to the Bankai being used, I'm assuming Kyoraku would have also been hit. Now, one thing we don't really know is, are the Bankai's acts intrinsically linked? Is the fact that Lille got injured here what triggers Act 2? I think it is. I think that's essentially what Kyoraku says when he says the man feels shame at taking those injuries. So you have to assume that if Kyoraku had been hit by the reflection of wounds, he too would have been hit by the plague. That leads me on to my next question then. Does getting hit by the plague mean that you get affected by Acts 3 and 4, whereas Kyoraku doesn't? And I have to say I don't think that is the case. I think Kyoraku is still affected by 3 and 4. He just isn't quite as weakened as Lille would be because he avoided 2. It's already getting a little bit confusing, I know. So Act 2 then is the weirdest one to me. It feels very disconnected from the rest of them, and I can kind of understand contextually how the others actually happen, but just suddenly contracting essentially the plague is pretty out there. And I think now's a really good time to talk about the story that's being told here, as it took a little while for it to actually click with me what was going on, and it actually helps to really bring the Bankai together in a neater package, for me at least anyway. So the story Kyoraku is telling is about a man and a woman, two lovers, who, like I said, the name of the Bankai is the lover's suicide. Now, what actually is going on here is it starts off with the man hits the woman, and then he feels great regret at doing that. And that is supposed to be the sharing of the wounds. The man who feels that regret gets hit by, I think it's supposed to be figurative. It's not literal, but he gets injured in the same way that he has hurt the woman. He feels that pain in his heart for what he has done. As he feels that regret for the injury he has caused, he sort of like collapses into what I would guess is like a terrible depression that gives him this horrible, incurable sickness. And he comes out, it's manifested in the Bankai as just loads of blood, but I think he's just supposed to be almost incurably ill, like a depression. Now, although the woman is the victim here, she is still his lover. They are still supposed to be in love. So she essentially gives him the option that they can both kill themselves together as like a lover's pact. And they decide to do this by throwing themselves into this freezing cold water. And once they do that, all of their resolve will evaporate. And this is important, and it was actually at this point that I kind of clocked that Kyoraku is referring to himself and Lille as the characters of the story here. So in Act 3, The Abyss, they both get plunged into the water, and Lille immediately panics and tries to escape by flying towards the surface, only to find it constantly getting further and further away. He's confused about this, but Kyoraku says, you know, you can't escape, you've already committed to this, you agreed to be thrown in here, you volunteered. Now, of course, Lille did not volunteer for this, but in the context of the story, he did. The character he's playing did volunteer to be thrown into the water. Lille is playing the abusive man. Kyoraku, in my opinion, is playing the woman. So Kyoraku mentions that the two of them being thrown into the ice-cold water like this is designed to test their resolve. However, Lille tries to escape, and in the context of the story, this is the man reneging on his promise to the woman and trying to flee and not actually going through with the suicide. And this actually really helped me make a lot more sense of the whole situation. Kyoraku says to Lille, you know, you're trying to get away, trust me, I know how you feel, but really you're just being selfish, you know, you're just thinking about yourself, you're breaking your promise. And I was reading this like, what is he talking about? Like, why is he being selfish? I don't understand it. And it did clock to me finally that Kyoraku they are playing the characters in the story. Lille is the man, Kyoraku is the woman. So Lille is breaking his promise to Kyoraku and trying to escape their certain death situation. Which then leads us on to Act 4. And Act 4 again is pretty straightforward, but Kyoraku just cuts Lille's throat. And what's happening here is, in the context of the story, the woman essentially grows tired of the man and his betrayals and all that sort of thing, and she just cuts his throat. You know, Kyoraku says that a woman's pity can be cruel, but also this woman has no time to lend an ear to a petulant man. So beforehand, after stage 2, she was like, all right, we can do this together. This is your chance. This is our chance to like be together in death. But the cowardly man tries to escape even that fate, and the woman's like, well, I've had enough of you now, and this is the new form of my pity, and she slashes his throat. In Bleach terms, Kyoraku essentially generates that figurative regret that Lille is feeling into a white string, and then he cuts his throat. So that's basically it. That's the story of the two lovers played out between Lille and Kyoraku, and it's scary to think because Lille is completely unwitting in this. He doesn't know the story. He has no idea what's going on. So you kind of have to assume that once Kyoraku uses his Bankai, you're in major trouble because, you know, unless you somehow have research on the Bankai prior, you have no idea what's going to actually set off the next stage, and Kyoraku is very much in control here. Katen Kyokotsu has always been predicated on the notion that the kind of games between the two combatants have to be fair. And I think the same is true here. What makes this Bankai a little bit difficult to comprehend is that Kyoraku suffers no ill effects whatsoever. I think it might have been good to have him suffer at least the first 2 effects, maybe have him injure Lille somehow before the Bankai and then feel those wounds himself, show the blood coming out of his mouth and stuff. That would have made it a lot easier to digest, and then when the two of them hit the water, have it so that Lille is the only one who tries to flee, allowing Kyoraku to take up the role of the woman at the end and kill him. Another thing that I find to be fascinating is that in between Acts 3 and 4, Katen herself actually arrives on the scene, draping her arms behind Kyoraku, and also when he activates his Bankai, you can see her silhouette doing the same thing to him. And what I think this is supposed to mean as well is that the two of them also represent the two characters in this story, but perhaps in a slightly different way. They perhaps represent them as two lovers who would actually go through with the pact together. They live and die together. And that's reinforced to me by Katen quite literally saying to Kyoraku, I am your sword after all, we agreed we would die together. And that really kind of makes me question, like, did Kyoraku think he wasn't going to get out of this? You know, when he activated his Bankai, maybe Kyoraku thought, this is the end for me, this fight, I'm probably going to die here. There's a lot going on in this battle in general, regardless of the Bankai. You know, like, Kyoraku basically does nearly pass away after this moment, until Nanao saves him, and Katen is like, let me drift you away. And that's interesting, because that makes me wonder as well, like, how far is the theming of this Bankai actually going? Because if you consider the moment where Kyoraku realizes that Lille is still alive despite having his head cut off, and he rests against the wall, and Katen is like, fall asleep and I'll take us both away. And that's supposed to be them committing suicide in the story, but then Kyoraku reneges on that promise by waking up to help Nanao. So that's actually fascinating. Obviously, he doesn't get his head cut off, but there's so many layers here. It is difficult to know exactly what's going on, but I think, at the very least, the 4-stage act play makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to see Kyoraku and Lille as representations of the man and the woman in that story. So now that the explanations are at least somewhat out of the way, I do have a couple of questions myself. Namely, how does this Bankai work? We just don't get enough evidence, I don't think. Do all 4 stages naturally progress from one to the other? Does this last stage trigger the next one? It would seem like it does. As I mentioned, Lille getting affected by Act 1 seemingly triggers Act 2, and Kyoraku isn't affected by 1, so he doesn't get 2, but then they're both affected by 3, and I really think the only way it works is by looking at them in the context of that story. And it is funny, because Kyoraku does kind of explain it to you. It's just, like, really obtuse. You just have to kind of get in there and get the nuggets of info out, as I think I've kind of done. So I hope this video has been kind of useful to you, if you didn't already know. But yeah, I think the best way of looking at it is, just to break it down really, really simply, Lille is the man, Kyoraku is the woman. The man hits the woman, feels terrible about it, and therefore comes down with an incurable disease, possibly some kind of depression or something like that in the actual story. The woman, being his lover, kind of forgives him and says, you know, we can both, like, go through with this lover's suicide pact. They throw themselves in the water. The man, being selfish, backs out of his promise and tries to escape. And the woman her pity now turned to cruelty, feels nothing for him anymore as he's a petulant child, and she cuts his throat. And that's basically it. What really intrigues me as well is this Bankai does seem to be an area of effect Bankai. Kyoraku says he doesn't want Nanao to get caught up in it, so how would that work? Nanao obviously never wounded Lille, so you have to presume that she wouldn't get affected by Act 1 if she was there, therefore she wouldn't get affected by Act 2. She doesn't have anywhere near as much Reiatsu as either of these two guys though, so the Abyss would presumably be pretty difficult for her to withstand. And I kind of guess that Kyoraku could warn her if they were both there at the same time, but if she's being afflicted by this some buildings away, she might just try and escape to the surface, at which point does Kyoraku just cut her throat? It's really difficult because Kyoraku does seem to have a level of agency in this Bankai that implies he is very much in control here while also being subjected to its whims, so that it's a little bit confusing. And just to wrap this video up then, I just want to talk about reception to this Bankai. Like I said, it was immeasurably anticipated, easily one of the Bankai people were most excited to see. And when we finally got it, I think people were a little disappointed. You know, people were a little bit like, what is going on here? You know, does this Bankai really relate to Kyoraku? How does it relate to Katen Kyokotsu? And just what the hell is going on? It feels very, very nebulous. And I get that. I felt similarly about it when I first read it, although I do appreciate it. The amount of thematic work that's gone into this Bankai I do think is incredible. My issue with the Bankai is nothing about it feels tangible. There is no connecting through line. Yes, you've got the fact that it's based on this story, it's telling a play, but all four of the acts look dramatically different. They look dramatically different, they feel dramatically different, and therefore there doesn't feel like there is really anything contextually binding them together. Bear in mind as well, this is a manga, it's a visual medium, so we really should have seen something to help us think like this. This is all part of Kyoraku's Bankai. This all makes more sense to me visually. So how would I have gone about changing this? Well, I'd have kept the acts, all that sort of thing exactly the same. Like I said, I love all that. I think that makes total sense. But just from an art perspective, I'd have done something small. Those black pine roots that appear at the very start of the Bankai, I'd have made them an actual thing, like have them burrow into the ground and stay there for the duration of the Bankai, or even better, have them form into a withered black pine tree that just hangs around in the background. Very ominous, very haunting, reminding you constantly that this is all part of Kyoraku's Bankai. It all falls under the same umbrella. And then, even if the acts do feel all very disparate, they can kind of come together under this one umbrella. So visually, you know, I love the whole black pine thing. I think it looks really, really cool, but you only see it a couple of times, and it's very much a figurative thing when you do, I think. Now, I think they probably do actually appear at the start of the Bankai, but they seem to disappear after that. So I would have just had like a tree or something looming in the background just to remind you that yes, this is all part of the same package essentially. But that's basically it for Kyoraku's Bankai. I really hope this video helped you. I think it's hopefully helping me, to be honest, to talk about it out loud, but it is kind of confusing. Contextually, it is a bit weird. And I know people were a little bit disappointed with the Bankai when it first came out, but you have to understand it is incredibly thematic. There's a lot going on here under the surface as well. It tells a really interesting story, and it's really cool seeing Kyoraku and Lille being the characters in that story playing it out. But that's it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to leave a thumbs up if you liked the video. Do let me know in the comments below what you thought of Kyoraku's Bankai. Did Kubo do the new Captain Commander justice in one of the final battles of the final arc? I'd love to see your comments down below. And until next time, guys, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.